that doesn't really hurt you in helping them. And I guess moral responsibility is close to that. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it, so that's my thought at this.
Okay, great. That's why we're doing this, because maybe we haven't given enough thought to some of these things and how they impact on our personal and community lives. But
Good morning.
Good morning. Who's that?
Oh, it says Bonnie's iPad. It's Bonnie Baker speaking.
Oh,
Hi.
Great. Hi, Bonnie.
Hi. If you were you finished making your point? Because if not, I'll wait.
Go ahead.
Okay. So the example I was thinking just came from last night, actually. So, I mean, I think we have a moral responsibility to help the most vulnerable in our society. And I heard rumors that National Council of Jewish Women's Passover Drive might well be canceled for this year. And I think that there are talks to do whatever we can to make sure that, you know, Passover food is delivered to those vulnerable people. And I think that's an ethical responsibility on the part of the Jewish community to do so in whatever way we can.
Great, thank you. And I think you brought up an interesting point, because sometimes we talk about, well, social responsibility, ethical responsibility, tikkun olam, action or not. It's not just a matter of taking on some kind of activity that expresses our connection to those values, but sometimes we have two responsibilities, ethical, moral, social, however we define them, that are in conflict with one another. And how do we balance and deal with those? So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But that's something to keep in mind. It's not always as simple as whether to do something or not to do something. It's sometimes you have to choose or find a balance that respects both of those activities, both of those values, both of those expressions of some type of responsibility, ethical, moral, social, however we define it. So I'm glad you brought that up. And there are many examples today, of course, where two of those such values or activities may be in conflict, and we have to make some kind of choice in terms of balance. So I wanted to take some time as well, now that we've just kind of opened up the discussion in that sense, to understand a little bit where we get this idea and this connection, this understanding with however we define social responsibility. So sometimes we see it as some kind of mission that we have. You're all probably familiar with the verse from Isaiah that talks about our responsibility because we've been given this covenant. I'll read it for you. Ani Adonai karaticha b'tzedek v'achzek biyadecha ve'etzorcha ve'tzoncha livrit im le'or goyim. לפקוח עיניים עיוורות, להוציא ממסגר אסיר, מבית כלא יושבי חושך. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness, and will hold your hand, and will keep you, and give for you a covenant of the people, for a light to the nations, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from the prison, and those who sit in darkness out of the prison house. So it's not just that we find personal initiative to be involved in this type of activity. We have some kind of injunction or direction of a divine nature that calls us out as part of the covenant, the relationship that we have with God, however we define that, as something that is inherent in that covenant. It's not a matter of simply being part of a covenant, but there's certain responsibilities that we have. And it gives you some of the examples which might have been relevant in the time of Isaiah or in earlier biblical historical times, but things that we have or that are incumbent upon us to perform as members in that community, in that covenant that we have with God. And there are other considerations when we're talking about that type of responsibility. Is it something we take upon ourselves for the benefits of community, for society? Or is it instead, or in addition, a responsibility we need to take on as a community, as a society? So the two ways of looking at social responsibility. We have a responsibility to society, or we have a responsibility as a society to deal with individuals, to deal with society, to deal with social issues. And sometimes those are two different ways of viewing this responsibility. something in terms of the act itself, who is recipient of that, but who is the performing that act? How is that act performed? In what manner is the act performed? In addition to the people who are going to be the recipients, the beneficiaries of that act of responsibility. And is there a need, in your opinion, to differentiate between individual and collective responsibility? Any thoughts on that? Okay, perhaps, sorry, who's that? Linda?
No, I didn't say anything.
Okay. So perhaps as we examine some of our sources, both biblical and rabbinic, we might get a better idea of how these things play out, both in terms of what we're expected to do and what we have done in the past. So let me ask you this. Where would you say, from your familiarity with the biblical text, where's the first instance of some biblical character taking on responsibility that goes beyond his or her own welfare and perhaps that of their family or their clan? Somebody decides to stand up for others who may not have a voice.
Moses.
But Moses is a great example, and Moses fights for his beloved people. Many instances we just read in the last week's Parsha Kitisa how fervently he believes in preserving and protecting his people. How about somebody a little bit earlier?
Abraham.
Excellent, Abraham. And what's our perhaps most familiar example of Abraham standing up for somebody?
With the city, with salt.
City of Sodom, that's right. So on the screen, you have the text from Bereshit 18, the various verses that deal initially with God's intent to go down, examine, explore what's happening in Sodom, and to see exactly what needs to be done and come to some conclusion. And I'll just read a couple of interesting passages here because it really informs us a little bit about where this idea of thinking of others comes from. So the first verse, Vayomer Adonai, Za'akat Sodom va'amora, ki raba v'chatatam ki chavda me'od, erdana ve'ere haketza'akata haba elai asukala v'imlo eda. So then the Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin is so grave. I will go down to see whether they've acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. Okay, so an interesting thing here. God says, he's hearing an outcry from Sodom, za'aka. And then it talks about chatatam. So often when we have two phrases in the same verse, we understand them to be parallel structure, parallel meaning, parallel message. However, here, the idea of za'aka is something we hear and understand more as in the second verse, it says, haketza'akata haba'ilai. So this idea of a cry, an outcry coming from Sodom, refers and relates to the people who are being victimized there, however we understand what was going on in Sodom. So when we talk about Abraham as being the first person concerned for the welfare of others, where does that come from? Where is his inspiration for that come from? It comes from God. God, although we may consider God omniscient and aware of everything that's going on, God seems to admit to something happening in Sodom, not quite clear, and God has to go down to examine what's going on to see if that outcry is something that needs to be responded to. And then the subsequent text that deals with the fact that God wants to wipe out Sodom, if necessary. What does Abraham say? And we don't have the whole text here. I hope that's not a coffee maker or a blender, but it's Abraham says, "Ulai yesh 50 tzadikim b'toch ha'ir." Maybe there are 50 people, righteous people in the city, and should they be destroyed? Should they be annihilated because of the evil, the sins of the others? And then, of course, the bargaining goes on until it becomes clear that there may not be anybody there. But the fact that Abraham has understood from God's initial statement about going down to check if there's a justified outcry there.
Hello. I'm way up in the 75th cloud because tomorrow, Skyped.
Okay.
And
Joyce?
with the kids. Oh, yeah, they're adorable.
Okay.
Oh, my God. Then ironic.
Okay, Joyce? Okay, hopefully that has been muted. In any case, God's intent is something that's impacted upon Abraham's decision to stand up as well. So we often credit Abraham with this initiative, but some of that inspiration comes from God. The fact that things need to be listened to, you need to go out and hear what's going on according to the outcry that has reached me. So it's a wonderful example of taking message, taking a hint from someone else about needing to do something if we haven't perhaps heard it on our own. So I asked at the beginning, what's the basis for our sense of social responsibility? So we talked about the fact that we're part of a covenant, that we have this responsibility as part of our relationship with God. But is the need for social responsibility one that should eventually be obviated, eliminated? Because if we take action, we can prevent there being those who need to cry out, because there will not be people who are victimized. That will cease due to our good actions. There's a fascinating verse in Deuteronomy that you see on the screen, which says a lot about the human condition. And whether or not you agree with this, it's a very powerful statement. Ki lo yachdal evion mikerv haaretz, al ken anochi metzavcha lemor, for there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land. So is that something that you agree with? The fact that no matter what we do, there are always going to be those who are going to cry out, those who need help, because that's the way humanity is. That's the way, if you allow me, God has created the world. God created the world intentionally for there to be a need for people to act out on social responsibility, for people to take responsibility for those who are less fortunate, who are in need of that, because there will always be people there. That is the way humanity works. There will never be, with this world, depending on your views of Olam Haba, perhaps that will not be the case in Olam Haba, but in this world, that's the way things will always be. What do you think about that statement?
It seems to be true. We've always seen that. We've never gotten better as far as there not being needy people in the world. We've never healed ourselves that way.
Mm-hmm.
But can I interrupt?
Go ahead.
It says, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land. Does that just mean your kinsmen or to everybody who's poor?
Excellent question. And you might say that this is a somewhat provincial, tribal view of what we're supposed to do. La'achicha, la'aniyecha, levincha be'artzecha. Only in your land, only to your fellow Israelite, perhaps the interpretation of achicha might be, but perhaps not. When we say la'achicha, your brother, the poor, you're destitute in your land, it doesn't mean that we need to limit our understanding of that. Your brother can mean every human being. It depends on how we interpret those terms. Your point is well taken that perhaps initially on the surface, it looks like a rather limited responsibility, but that's according to our interpretation of that sentence, of that verse. I don't think it necessarily limits us to only those that we see as kinspeople. Kinspeople can include all humanity.
Actually, we're all God's children, so we're all kinsmen.
Mm-hmm. So it depends on what our familiarity with those terms are. We often define and understand, interpret those terms as having some kind of limitation, perhaps Israelite Jewish covenantal definition. That needn't be the case. We can certainly broaden that depending on how broad we're willing to go with those definitions. But a point well taken. I want to bring your attention to another verse from Deuteronomy as well. Deuteronomy is a wonderful guide to some of these issues of social responsibility. So it says, Hishamer lecha pen yeh davar im levavcha v'liyah lemor karva shnat hasheva shnat hashmita v'ra'a eincha be'achicha hevyon v'lo titen lo v'kara alecha Elonai v'haya b'cha chet. So beware that there be not a base thought in thy heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of least, the sabbatical years we're familiar with, is at hand. And thine eye be evil against thy needy brother, and thou give him not, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be sin in thee. A little archaic English for that. But the point being that when the sabbatical year comes along, and this idea of everyone having a break, including the land, and people who have had an opportunity to store up food and other goods, very appropriate today when we're talking about hoarding. What do we do with that stored food? If we've had opportunity to get to the supermarket first, if we have fields from which we can glean and take all the produce and store in our storage yard, what about those who are without land in ancient times? What about those who are without the means, without the physical capability to get to a supermarket before all the toilet paper or paper towels have been taken off the rack? What do we do in that instance? And so it's quite clear that our responsibility is there. And it says, interestingly, v'ra'a eincha. Ra'a means your eye should not be evil. It should not turn evil against your brother, against your your needy brother. But you can also see that when you talk about the eye, why would they use evil eye here? I would say that the idea of the eye is something that we're often all too aware of. What we see is often what we respond to, and what we try to avoid seeing are those things we choose not to respond to. And I imagine we wouldn't have to think too hard about instances where our eye has turned evil in the sense we've avoided looking for those things, for those people who are needy. How many times, and this will be rhetorical, don't answer, how many times have you walked by a person on the street, someone sitting outside a grocery store or a Shoppers Drug Mart, and tried to avoid looking at them? How about somebody walking past you at an intersection or on the exit ramp for the Allen Road at Eglinton, when somebody walks by the car with a sign saying, I'm pregnant and hungry, and you've left your window closed or waited impatiently for the light to turn green so you wouldn't have to face that situation. Or perhaps you've tried to make contact and explain you have no change. Or when was the last time you actually opened up your window and pulled out a toonie and gave it to them? And policy notwithstanding that I don't want to give people money, they don't know what to do with that money. I'm not sure that's for us to decide. But we've all been in those situations where our eye has become evil by being closed or averting a situation which we should be responding to and for which we have a responsibility to respond to. So something that talks about a sabbatical year thousands of years ago is something no less relevant today in our current scenarios, whether it be specifically the coronavirus issue or our daily encounters and missed opportunities to engage with those who are needy and whom we choose to ignore for whatever reasons. But perhaps it's maybe a bit too much to expect from the average person. And what can we, in a sense, expect from somebody in terms of initiating and responding to need? So you're probably all familiar with Pirkei Avot, wonderful ethical, moral guide to behavior, mostly on a personal basis, how we deal with a whole array of situations regarding our family, regarding our community, regarding our study habits, etc. And I would say that even more than the golden mean, this statement attributed to Hillel is a very powerful one in terms of social responsibility. Hu haya omer, im ein ani li mili, uchshani la'atzmi ma'ani, ve'im lo achshav, ematai. He, Hillel, used to say, if I am not for myself, who is for me? But if I for myself only, what am I? And if not now, when? So these three statements address very powerfully how, and perhaps in the order the order in which we need to think in order to respond appropriately to social responsibility. And what does that mean? If I can't take on responsibility for myself, if I don't see myself as somebody for whom I need to address needs, then how can I do anything? Because I can't count on anyone else necessarily being for me. But at the same time, once I have come to the realization and understanding of what I need, what my basic needs are, then I can begin to address the others. Because if I don't have and maintain a certain dignity and self-respect, then how am I going to show that and understand that with regards to others? And once I've come to that conclusion, then there's no reason why I shouldn't have an urgency about it and say, what am I waiting for? I understand what I need. I understand that if I need certain things, then my fellow human being needs certain things. And if we all need certain things, then what am I waiting for, contemplating this rather than stepping into action? And of course, action has always been the predominant injunction we receive. It's wonderful to study. It's wonderful to contemplate. It's wonderful to intellectually exercise our minds. But if we don't translate that at some point into some action, then we're not doing what we're supposed to do. And that's why I think this saying by Hillel is as powerful as anything else in terms of how we need to relate to our fellow human being. Any comments?
Well, it's true. Michael, it's a very true statement. You have to be your own advocate in order to be able to define the things that you require. Because no one else will really do that for you. You know, in fact, what you want, and it is up to you to initiate whatever action is necessary to further that. Mm-hmm. No one else would know exactly what's on your mind, even though they may be able to interpret a lot of what you say. But unfortunately, a lot of it could be misconstrued. So, as far as I'm concerned, you are your best advocate. Do what you consider to be right and emphasize that to others and let them know.
Great. Okay. Anyone else?
I think with the
a simple question. One simple question. How do we know from this particular meeting how many people are actually associated with it?
Well, I don't know if I guess you don't have access. Again, I'm learning how to use this as well. I have access to see how many people are here. And what I'll do is,
4 people.
Okay.
You see 4
Yeah.
all together. I'll tell you how many there are. There's are
36 right now.
36 people right now.
Okay, very good.
Sorry, he interrupted somebody who was going to say something.
Right, sorry.
It was Linda.
Okay, go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking in terms of this situation that we're in now with the virus, that we have to look after our own health first, and but not isolate ourselves, even if we're in isolation, but to look out for other people who may be lonely or suffering by themselves and reaching out in any way we can, virtually or whatever. And not to wait, to do it all the time and do it now, but continue to do it because this is going to be a long haul.
Thank you. Thank you.
But Anna, I foresee, pardon me, that people get all together when there's a crisis. Then when the crisis is over, we go back to our own selfish ways, which is not a great idea. So we should keep on put our hand out to help others all the time. I'm on the phone, so I hear an echo. So I hope it isn't interfering with you.
Okay, we hear you fine, Anna. Thank you very much for that. Anyone else?
The expression, God helps those who help themselves, would that come in line with your first comment here? He used to say, if I am not for myself, who is for me? That you have to help yourself, not just stand back and beg, but you should try to help yourself and then others, obviously, once you're okay.
I think those things tie in together. The idea that the famous stories in the Jewish tradition about somebody waiting around for something to happen, and God says, "What are you waiting for?" That I'm paraphrasing. That you need to do something on your own. You need to start doing something if you expect me to help. So this idea of understanding what I need, what I'm able to do for myself as well, because you may say, if I'm not for myself, who is for me? So I'll take care of all my own needs. But part of that self-awareness or understanding your needs is also understanding what your limitations are and what you may not be able to answer of your own needs. And therefore, it gives you a greater awareness that others' needs need to be answered as well, because others may be in that same situation, whether it's a divine source from which that help stems, or whether it's from others in your community or outside your community that help. That understanding of, I'm not going to be able to take care of everything on my own for my own needs. Because a person who comes to that conclusion is unlikely to be aware that others have needs as well. You have to be aware of limitations that you experience in order to be able to identify with the limitations that others have. And that's not something everyone is perhaps willing to do. I won't say able to do, but often willing to do. You may think to yourself, I'm aware of what I need. I know what I need to do. I'm going to do all that. It's unlikely if you come to that conclusion that you're going to get to the next step in Hillel's phrase here.
Can I make a comment?
Absolutely.
I really like how you framed Hillel's comment as a sequence of response. The other thing I might add is that there's a proportionality also. Well, we all have to take care of ourselves. Some of us are more capable or have more means than others to take care of others and that, or respond to others, and that changes the algorithm a little bit in terms of the urgency for response by some people.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So somebody mentioned before this idea that we need to have an understanding of how we go about this. We're talking about, through Hillel's statement, about personal awareness of ourselves, of our limitations, of that of others as well, and of a sense of urgency. And perhaps once we feel that, we have to make sure that, as somebody mentioned before, as Hillel said, Al tifrosh min hatzibur. Do not separate yourself from the community. So even once you have your own answers, your own needs answered, and as you mentioned before, in situations where there isn't a crisis, and perhaps more correctly, it's often crisis that brings us together and drives us to action. But even when there's no crisis, you have to see this injunction as remaining part of the community as something that's essential, because there are many situations where needs need to be answered that are not at crisis level. And perhaps it's our responsibility to make sure that we are aware of things before they get to crisis level. And we can only do that if we are constantly part of a community. Because once we step aside from the community, once we think a crisis is over, there's no longer any urgent need for something, once we lose that sense of urgency, which there should always be, then there's a good chance that, as you suggested, we're not going to be aware of some of the minor things. And again, in my words, minor. What may be minor to us, or we interpret as minor, may be a personal crisis for somebody else. But since it's not a community crisis, we choose or are not to be aware, or are simply not understanding how impactful that situation is on that individual. So the only way we can do that is if we're constantly seeking ways to remain part of community. And as you said, in a crisis, it's almost easy because we all have needs in a crisis. But when that crisis is not there, we need to find ways to maintain. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for any congregation or community. How do we encourage and motivate people to constantly remain part of that community, even when there's no urgently stated need for something? And I'll give you an example. So a need, it may not be urgent, but when a bar or bat mitzvah family comes and joins a shul, or even before that, when they feel there's a need for their children to have some kind of Jewish education, which for whatever reasons, they haven't incorporated as part of their life routine until now. So that's a need that the synagogue tries to answer. When it comes to celebrating becoming bar mitzvah for their child, then we find ways to offer something hopefully that's meaningful and inspiring for them. What happens after that need, as understood by the family, is no longer there. Their kids had their basic Jewish education, their bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah has taken place to their great satisfaction. They no longer see a need to be part of a community because they've answered what they interpret as their basic needs. Now they can focus their resources, both time and financial, on other activities which seem more meaningful to them. So whose responsibility is it to find ways of keeping a connection between that family and the community?
Would it be the parents and the synagogue to try and engage the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, b'nai mitzvah?
I'll leave that open to others who'd like to respond.
I think at the top of the list, the individual himself or herself should want to continue the education. I think in the majority of cases, if I'm not mistaken, most people that have had their bar or bat are truly not that interested.
I would connect this back to what we understood about Hillel before. Somebody being aware of their needs, whether it be for their children, education of a general sense, or a bar bat mitzvah celebration. It's our responsibility during that time that we share experience with that family to make sure that they understand that other families have that need as well. And that's part of the reason for having a b'nai mitzvah program. To understand that there's a sense of community in our congregation and beyond it, in the general community as well, and seeing that while their individual needs may be met, it's not a matter of only meeting their individual needs, their needs of other individuals in the community. And the moment they have left that community, they're no longer aware or they're demonstrating an indifference to the needs of others. And so I would say without question, we can say the responsibility of theirs is to continue to be engaged, to help others, but it's the responsibility of a community to make sure that that individual, that family, is aware that there are expectations of them as well. It's not just about answering your own needs, but ensuring that as part of that community, you're addressing the needs of others in that community, whether they be similar to yours, a bar bat mitzvah celebration, or they be other type of needs.
Michael, I think of when people are saying Kaddish, who haven't been actively involved with the synagogue, and often that's a point at which through community, people do come into the fold or into the synagogue more. And I hadn't thought of bat or bar mitzvah, but it could well be the same, that through programs like yours, the families might form some sense of community with the other families that might keep them involved.
Absolutely.
That's a big difference between bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah and saying Kaddish. There's a lifetime in between.
So let me connect those two for you, Anna. And I'll give you let me share with you, I've shared with you before, I think, one of the more powerful experiences I've had. Some of my students come at the time where the minyan takes place. And often I'm busy with the student and don't always attend the minyan in the evening, making sure that there's somebody capable. We're lucky to have Esther there and others who help run the minyan in my absence, and the absence perhaps of other clergy. But one of the more powerful experiences I had was when there was a minyan. It was the middle of winter. I had a student who came. It was just the minyan was taking place before their after their lesson. We'd finished the lesson, and there was not a minyan there. There were only 8 people, from what I recall. And I said to that student, would you mind, with the parent as well, would you mind staying in order for us to ensure that we have a minyan? And unfortunately, often when I ask parents, they're on their way, they're rushing to get to a ballet lesson or a hockey game or something else, so they can't always stay. And I understand that. Fortunately, in this opportunity, the family made the choice to stay. And I recall watching the face of that bar mitzvah, understanding that he was the enabler. He was the facilitator for that minyan. Had he not been there, the people who came to say Kaddish would not have said Kaddish. And to this day, that student, who's no longer a young man, he's in his early 20s, that person has occasionally come and made a point of attending a minyan, knowing full well and understanding the importance of what that sense of community means. And so it's our job, it's our task, and it's our responsibility to make sure young people and families understand what it means to be part of community beyond the celebration of a bar or bat mitzvah ceremony, but that there are other aspects of community that can be meaningful for them at the same time that the needs of others are being addressed and answered.
Well said. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So continuing with this idea of community and remaining part of the community, you're all familiar with Abraham Joshua Heschel, many wonderful things in his career. One of the things he said was there are inalienable obligations as well as inalienable rights. So when we talk about being part of a community, a congregation, and however we define that idea of community, we often see initially our entry into a community as something that can provide us with the things that we need. And following up on what we said before, there also is this idea that you have to, if you're going to make use and take advantage of the rights and privileges that are offered to you in a community, you have to realize there are obligations as well. Otherwise, that community doesn't exist and is certainly not sustainable. And that's something we need to make more of an effort, certainly I think in the younger generation, however we define that, to make sure that they find things that are worthwhile for them in terms of answering their needs, but at the same time is making them understand that any community, whether it be a congregation, whether it be a sports club, any type of community, however we define it, has obligations in addition to rights. And that can only be true and relevant when people feel that they have not been alienated from a community. Somebody who feels alienated, neglected, ignored is very unlikely to feel any type of social responsibility. So when we look at elements either in a congregation or in our society who we have as a society or as a community neglected and ignored, we can't expect them to feel any sense of social responsibility. And in a sense, I don't hesitate to say that through our negligence, we're denying them the opportunity and the privilege of social responsibility. It sounds a bit strange, but there are advantages to social responsibility and acting in that way beyond what we receive directly, tangibly in return in terms of being part of that community. And that's something we need to think of as well. And if we don't allow others to feel part of a community, we're probably denying them the opportunity to share that sense of social responsibility with others. When it comes to responsibility for others, you're familiar with the various requirements in terms of agriculture. Everyone know what leket, peah, and shichacha are? So those are, in an agricultural world, what we do to be aware of or demonstrate an awareness of the fact that there are those who don't have fields, who don't own land, at least thousands of years ago, I guess it perhaps as recently as a couple hundred years ago, and have no means of sustaining themselves. So what do? Those of us who were fortunate enough available, we leave a corner of the field where we don't gather the crops for the poor people. We, whatever falls as we're gathering the crops, we leave there. We don't bend down to pick it up again. And whatever we've forgotten, if we left a part of our field for whatever reason that we didn't get to it, we don't go back and harvest the crops from there. We leave that for the poor people. So I would say that is probably the easiest thing to do, and something which most of us in one way or another do. If you think about this time of year, it's tax season. So by the end of 2019, most of us made sure that we filled out some forms and left donations in various organizations, which we either have a habit or routine of doing on an annual basis, or did, and nothing wrong with that, because we know that there's going to be some kind of tax benefit for whatever donations we make. We don't often, in those situations, have a direct engagement or connection with those who are going to be the beneficiaries of that decision. It's something we do because it has some practical and perhaps tangible expression for us. And we can halachically legislate that because people are going to probably abide by that. It's an easy one to abide by. And some faith communities have a more demanding legislation of donations to be made in terms of percentages. We have this framework, however we define and express it today, where we allow ourselves and in a sense encourage and expect of ourselves to leave those elements of what we've made during the course of the year aside for others. And most of us, even if grudgingly, comply with that requirement because there is some kind of tangible benefit for it. So that's perhaps the easiest stage of feeling some kind of, expressing some kind of social responsibility. Then there's this suggestion, again, this isn't halakha, this is a suggestion, as most of Pirkei Avot is. We can see that as a rabbinic law, as opposed to the biblical laws that we've shared from Leviticus and from Deuteronomy. So what does it say? Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim omer, Yehi veitcha fatuach lirvacha, v'yu aniyim b'nei veitecha. Yossi ben Yochanan, someone from Jerusalem, used to say, let your house be wide open and let the poor be members of your household. So that's a far cry from making a donation at the bottom of your submitting whatever the form is for tax donations at the end of the year. Here, you're, in a sense, passively leaving your door open for people to enter in order to share a meal, in order to share a place to sleep, in order to come in and perhaps ask for some kind of donation. Meaning that door should be open should somebody pass by and need that service. So I say that's perhaps the next stage because, again, we're not necessarily initiating anything here. We're saying, all right, you know what? I'm not going to go out and search for these people, but if one just happens to walk by, that's fantastic. So on Pesach, for the Seder, we leave our door open. We leave our door open for Eliyahu Hanavi. But there's a more meaningful idea of leaving your door open. Leaving your door open, as you stated at the beginning of the Seder, Kol dichvin yetei ve'echol. All those who are in need should come and enter my house and celebrate the Passover Seder with me. I doubt I'll have a positive answer to this, but how many of you left their door open on the eve of Passover and some poor person who never had the opportunity and doesn't have the resources available walked in the door and joined you welcomingly for your Seder? That ever happened to you? No. So when we make that gesture of opening our door, of proclaiming Kol dichvin yetei ve'echol, we're at least making the step, taking a step along the lines of what Yossi ben Yochanan suggests, that we should have our door open. But having your door open, in a metaphorical sense, is not a whole lot. It doesn't do a whole lot practically. It's a great step in terms of acknowledgement that there are people out there who need, but those people are not most likely going to come by and enter your house. And nowadays, the way neighborhoods are set up, unless you happen to live in certain neighborhoods where that might be a phenomenon, people are not going to come by your house and ask for money, or come and ask for a meal, or request a place to sleep because they're on the street. There needs to be an expectation to go beyond that step and perhaps seek out those people rather than expecting to come by your place. So that's perhaps another level of awareness of a need out there, but it's not sufficient. And I think our texts, as we'll see in a moment as well, they kind of lead us, even if not in a chronological order, from coming to some awareness of who we are as human beings and what we need to do to express that, how we take advantage of opportunities to help others, whether we do it grudgingly, whether we do it because we have some tangible benefit, whether we do it passively, expecting perhaps somebody to come by and take advantage of an offer which has not necessarily been in any way publicly proclaimed, or if we do other things that are perhaps a little more active. So let's take a look at another couple of texts back from the book of Deuteronomy, and let's do a little bit of study for a few minutes here and see what we can understand from this.
Michael, before you move on,
sure.
I just want to say that it's one thing to say, have your door open, but if nobody knows that it is open and you're willing to help, what good does it do just to open your door?
Absolutely, and that's a fantastic rhetorical question.
Is there an answer?
Let's go on and see if we have an answer for that. I think there is, and let's explore a couple more texts and see what the conclusion we can come to. So here we have this wonderful text from Deuteronomy talking about the fact, if you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If you don't know where he lives or you don't know who he is, bring it home and it'll remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. Do the same with his ass, with his garment, with anything your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. And same thing with you, if you find the ass or ox fallen on the road, you must not ignore it, you must help him raise it. So again, this goes back perhaps to what I said before, although God forbid, and lehavdil, comparing people who are on the street as opposed to somebody's possession or somebody's animal who's gone astray. It's a matter of not remaining indifferent. Lo tuchal lehitalem, very powerful word in Hebrew. You can't ignore, you can't remain indifferent to something you see. And how do you see something? You have to open your eyes. You have to be willing. And not v'ra'a encha. Your eye should not turn evil by being closed and being negligent or making an active effort to ignore what's right in front of you. The Torah is telling us you can't do that. You got to pay attention to what's out there in front of you. You can't walk by it. You can't ignore that person or that animal, that poor animal that's suffering, even your fellow human being's property. You have an obligation to take charge and do something that's there in front of you and respond to it in an appropriate and responsible manner. It's quite clear here. And when we take that a step further, when we come back to the human element, and here's a very powerful example, again, from Deuteronomy as well. When we come across, in the case of a virgin who is engaged to a man, if a man comes upon her in town and lies with her, you shall take the two of them out to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The girl, because she did not cry for help in the town, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. Thus you will sweep away evil from your midst. The second case, and we'll come back to this in a moment, but if the man comes upon the engaged girl in the open country, and the man lies with her by force, only the man who lay with her shall die, but you shall do nothing to the girl. The girl did not incur the death penalty, for this case is like that of a man attacking another and murdering him. He came upon her in the open, though the engaged girl cried for help, there was no one to save her. Okay, so fascinating cases here, and we can respond to this based on our perhaps understanding of things that go on in our community, in our cities. So the first case is if somebody's in a city and you don't hear their cry for help. According to this, it says if she was in the town, then she would have cried if she needed help. And we can understand whoever that person is in whatever situation. But if they're in the city and you don't hear the cry, it means that person didn't cry because you would have heard it. However, in the field, the assumption is that even if that person did cry out, you didn't hear it, and therefore she can't be guilty. You can't be sure if she did or didn't cry out. And of course, something that comes to mind in these very challenging examples, if you recall, well, at least maybe most of you may recall this, but almost exactly, 50 56 years ago, on March the 13th in 1964. You probably all heard of the example of Kitty Genovese, that woman who was murdered in New York, who apparently cried out in the middle of a city. But despite those cries, and although the accounts and the description of the events were somewhat distorted and exaggerated, the fact is that nobody helped her, whether it was 35 people that were originally claimed to have heard and not responded, or even if it was the 2 that eventually were proven to have heard and didn't respond. There was opportunity to save that person. That person cried out, but people hit almu. They remained indifferent or fearful of getting involved and chose not to get involved. And at the same time, we can also think of things, responses that are very different. If you think about today in Israel and other places, and particularly 9/11, you think of the fact that people were in crisis, people were in great danger, many people lost their lives in different events, but there's also this human response to rush to the scene. And I can't tell you how many examples, and terrorists are aware of this, when a bomb goes off and people need help, people rush to help them. And what has been done in the past with suicide bombers, they're aware of that human tendency to go help people, in contrast to what I mentioned before, and they have another person who sets off a bomb after those people have come to help the original injured people. And same thing with 9/11. If you think about how many people went to help, whether it's the first responders, the fire people, the police, etc., all those people who rushed to a scene where they knew they were in great danger, despite that, they answered those calls, those tza'akot, the fact that somebody was crying out despite the danger, and went to help at risk of their lives, and many at loss of their lives, to help those people. It's fascinating that the 911 that people are encouraged to call if they're aware of an emergency, so perhaps there's this ability to stay detached, but at least do something about it. The fact that the events of 9/11 occurred on 9/11, which is similar to that 911, perhaps is no coincidence. But we see this ambiguous tendency among human beings, on the one hand, at least in certain cases, to avoid getting involved, to avoid answering those cries when they come to our attention. But at the same time, we also feel a need to answer those cries and go, even at risk of our lives. It's a fascinating human response, and in terms of conflict of human response. On the one hand, we do this, on the other hand, we may do this. And you can decide which you see to be the more prevalent one. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Michael, it almost seems it's like the size and scope of the issue tends to be the reason why people respond. You know, you talked about on an individual basis, people in need, where we turn our eyes or, lower our heads and walk in a different direction. Yet in a major issue as what's going on now, or with 9/11 or other things like that, we tend to run to those things. So I don't know, why the scope of the event seems to be the biggest issue that tends to propel people in one way or another.
It's a great point. It's a great point. And you're right. There seems to be some kind of tendency along those lines. The greater the crisis, the greater the tragedy, the more willing people seem to be respond, and people are perhaps less paralyzed than involvement in some kind of individual, personal. And that may have a lot to do with it socially. When we respond to a mass crisis, there isn't that danger of personal exposure on a one-on-one basis. Whereas when we need to help an individual in crisis, you can't avoid getting perhaps emotionally involved. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but there may be something to do with that rush to help in mass crisis, and at the same time remaining maybe emotionally detached. I'm not sure, but your point is well taken. Anyone else? Okay, let's take a look at one other example here. So this is also a fascinating one, also from Deuteronomy. כי ימצא חלל באדמה, אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך לרשתה, נופל בשדה, לא נודע מי הכהו. I'll go through the English. If in the land that the Lord your God is assigning you to possess, someone slain is found lying in the open, the identity of the slayer not being known, your elders and magistrates shall go out and measure the distances from the corpse to the nearby towns. The elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall then take a heifer which has never been worked, which is never pulled in a yoke. So what's going on here? Somebody has been murdered outside the precincts of a town, of a community. No idea who the perpetrator is. So the elders, the judges of all the cities around need to go out and measure whose town is closest to the scene of the crime, assuming that that's where the crime took place. And you can imagine the trepidation of those judges and magistrates and elders as they measure, awaiting the verdict, who is closest to that corpse, and wishing that the measurements show that they're at least slightly further away from it than their neighbors. And why might that be? Because what's going to happen afterwards? The elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the wadi. This is a fascinating ritual. And they shall make this declaration. Yadenu lo shafchu et adam hazeh ve'einenu lo ra'u. Our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. Absolve, God, your people Israel, whom you redeemed, and do not let guilt for the blood of the innocent remain among your people Israel, and they will be absolved of blood guilt. Thus you'll remove from your midst guilt for the blood of the innocent, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord. So those of you who are or not familiar with this fascinating ritual and tradition, what do you think of it?
What's the purpose of it? I mean, nobody knows who did the deed. So why blame, perhaps, innocent town people?
Great question. Anyone have an answer? So what's the purpose of this? So people can feel, you know what? We had nothing to do with this. It's not our fault. Let me wash my hands of all guilt. It reminds me of Pontius Pilate and many others in films, washing their hands, washing themselves of any involvement in the scene and any responsibility for what happened.
I think it's the idea of the scapegoat, that there's a long history of the sins of man are put on the goat and it's sent out.
Okay. So let's find something so we can feel better about this and cleanse ourselves through some kind of ritual, whether it be a scapegoat, whether it be this poor heifer whose neck was broken, and absolve ourselves of any culpability for what happened, not far from where we live. That sound like Jewish social responsibility to you?
No.
No.
So what are they really trying to say here? I would suggest that, first of all, you go through this torturous process of measuring whose city is closest to get these people to start thinking, my God, what's happened just outside our city walls? And what if it's our city that turns out to be the closest? We're going to have to go through this ritual of trying to absolve ourselves of the guilt. And when they say, our hands did not shed this blood, nor eyes did not see it done, what are they saying really? They're saying, you know what? We don't know who the slayer is. We don't know who committed this crime. But we're really as guilty and responsible, in a sense, as the murderer. What did we not do in order to prevent this from happening? What could we have done to make our fields, and of course our cities, safer places so these kind of deeds wouldn't happen? So when we're saying, I would say rather facetiously, yeah, our hands did not shed this blood, we're torturing ourselves. Our hands did not shed this blood, but they might as well have. Our eyes did not see it done, but they should have. We should have been aware that this kind of situation could have happened, because we're allowing circumstances to be where people can be killed out in an open field. So far from really absolving of the townspeople of responsibility. They're absolved of guilt for the specific incident, but they're not absolved of responsibility for not having done enough to prevent it. And so this is an incredibly powerful ritual that says to any town around which such an event has occurred, we didn't do enough. We can't just wait for things to happen and then respond. We have to go out there actively to create circumstances which prevent these things from happening. And yes, ki lo yachdal evyon me'aretz. There will always be destitute and needy people. There will always be murderers. But that acceptance and acknowledgement doesn't mean that there isn't more we can do to have fewer murders, to have fewer destitute and needy people out there whose needs and safety are being ignored or neglected. So this is another step forward in saying we can't just be complacent about responding to needs as they come to our attention. We need to go out and seek ways of dealing with those people who are in situations of crisis. We need to go out and seek ways and means and make resources available to make sure that these things are prevented to the greatest of our ability. So I think this is an incredibly powerful statement about a next stage in social responsibility. It's not enough to respond to something. We have to go actively and seek ways of preventing as much as we can, acknowledging the fact that things are going to happen. We're not going to stop every example, but we have to make sure we do what we can to mitigate those cases and to limit and make sure there are fewer as possible.
And that's basically what the government's doing right now. They're shutting everything down, so we're not communicating with each other, or not seeing each other. They're trying to limit having more deaths from the virus.
But Michael, if it's Linda, if the separation of the areas or the town's responsibility in those days is quite different from the global environment that we live in today, where you can say, well, it's happening in Italy, so they'll deal with it. It's not our problem. We can separate ourselves. We can wash our hands of any problem they have, but in fact, it's affecting the whole world. And you know, whether it's war or disease or whatever, what happens in one part of the world today affects the whole world.
That's right. That's right. We can no longer say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It affects everybody wherever we are. And you're right. In this global community, there is no longer measuring who's closest to a crisis, who's closest to a crime that was committed. We all, as you wisely said, need to take measures to make sure that doesn't happen. It's not a matter of saying, well, you're the nearest to that. You deal with that. It doesn't work anymore. You're right. Great point.
Michael, if I could add, as I look at this statement, it leaves me somewhat unsatisfied. To me, unless I'm mistaken, the underlying assumption is that the town that's closest to the body is most likely to be responsible. But if the man is out in the field, you really don't know which town he came from. And so it would seem to me that all the townspeople from around should have at least some responsibility. They shouldn't be running to determine, you know, where he might have come from. It just seems to me unsatisfying in that way, that somebody comes across a dead body in the middle of a field and says, well, I'd rather not be responsible for this.
Michael, it's Brenda.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. Good to hear you.
I finally got connected. I think what it comes down to is responsibility. And I think that with this current health crisis that we're all dealing with, we don't know what's going to happen in a minute from now, or 5 minutes from now, or even an hour from now. So I think we have to deal with this literally minute by minute. Do whatever we can, but I think we have to do it in small time increments. And I think it's the same. You still coming to this quote from Deuteronomy. It all comes down to everybody has to assume a responsibility of some type.
Okay. There are a few other things I want to cover in the time left to us, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to continue a little bit of discussion. So I want to relate to a few historical issues. I mean, we've been talking about a number of them as we go along, but let's talk about something you're probably also familiar with. I mentioned the event in March of 1964 regarding the murder of Kitty Genovese. And there's another event that also happened in March, not too long ago, well, a little bit longer ago, 109 years ago, as a matter of fact. You're probably familiar with the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York. And why do I bring this up? Because as a result of that event, there were a lot of legislation that was eventually instituted to protect people, to protect workers in different situations. And that may not be one of our major concerns today about what our responsibility for workers are, but any of you who are employers of whatever nature know and are aware that we have a certain obligation to our workers. And do you know who the owners of the shirtwaist factory were? The Triangle Factory? They were a couple of Jews, Isaac Harris and Max Blank. The lawyer who defended them was a Jewish lawyer, Max Steuer. And despite all that, although there were different understanding of exactly what the conditions were, it was quite clear that the interests and protection and safety of the workers was not perhaps a primary concern, and something that led to a lot more emphasis on that in later years. There's a famous speech by Rose Schneiderman who deals with this, who addressed this shortly after the event took place, where she says, those of you who are on phone, I'll just read this briefly, "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The old Inquisition had its rack and its thumbscrews and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work. And the rack is here in the fire trap structures that will destroy us the minute they catch on fire." So she's addressing the good people of the public. Who are those good people of the public? Is it the government? Is it the people who enact legislation? Is it the Jewish owners? Is it the Jewish community? Because most of the women there who worked in that factory, as many of the other sweatshop factories, were Jews, immigrants who came from Eastern Europe. And this was their one way to find some kind of sustainable way of living through a very, probably mostly inadequate wage. It did nothing to secure their safety while they were working. And so somebody's calling the public, again, different ways of defining who that would be, to task for not being aware of these situations, and probably worse, for being aware and not doing anything because of the personal interest, financial or otherwise, that the owners and the public and perhaps the government had in these. And there are interesting things with regards to safety of workers. If we look back at Deuteronomy, we say we have an obligation. It's not waiting for a fire to occur before responding and coming up with legislation. It's a matter of putting in place things that protect the safety of workers. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, so that you do not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. You don't wait for hazardous conditions to take their toll on someone. You make sure you put up preemptive measures so that does not occur. And in Baba Metzia it says, why does he climb a ladder? Why do people take on these dangerous tasks? In 1911, working in a sweatshop. Nowadays, climbing a ladder, hanging from a tree, risking his life, if not for his wages. So these people need to work these dangerous tasks because they don't have a choice in a sense. You can say they always have a choice, but there may not be a lot of options available. So they do this often because that's what's available. It's our responsibility to make sure that they have the opportunity to earn their wages through appropriate safety measures. So we have this enacted. I'll bring up something very fascinating I came across recently as well. There was recently a tshuva written in the Rabbinical Assembly back in 2008, which deals with who we hire as workers. And the Tshuva says this, I'll just read the English. The law allows for the existence of unions in order that the individual worker not be left on his own to the point that he hires himself out for a low wage in order to satisfy his hunger and that of his family with a bit of bread and water and with a dark and dingy home. In order that the worker may protect himself, the law gives him the legal right to organize and to establish stipulations that benefit the members of his profession. All of these things can only be fulfilled through a workers' union. Therefore, the Torah gave the Jewish people the full and legal right to organize these, even though it is possible that such unions will result in a financial loss for the employers. So this was a tshuva written back in 2008, and it came to very recent practicality because the JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, was undergoing a construction project beginning a couple of years ago, and they went into negotiations with the various contractors without necessarily emphasizing the importance of hiring union workers, but looked for what they call open shop or merit shop workers. And there was a lot of discussion about how this tshuva and the emphasis it places on the rights and safety of workers was perhaps not taken into consideration. I won't go into all the details of this. It's a fascinating case, and I would suggest you look it up yourself. But here's a very contemporary example of the conflict sometimes between the interests, financial otherwise, of owners, of employers, as opposed to those of workers, which, as we've seen in our texts, both biblical and rabbinic, are protected and perhaps not always taken as seriously as they should be taken. So somebody raised a while ago the question of, when we talk about achicha, evyoncha, be'artzecha, who is it that we should be looking out for? Is it just Jews? Is it just our community? Is it just those who live among us, those who live in our country? There's something we read on a regular basis, taking from the Talmud Gittin. As a matter of fact, it's in our daily Siddur. Talks about the fact one does not protest against poor Gentiles who come to take gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor. Those are the things I mentioned before, leket peyav v'shichacha. Although they are meant exclusively for the Jewish poor, we don't do this on account of the ways of peace. Similarly, the sages taught in a Baraita, one sustains poor Gentiles along with poor Jews, one visits sick Gentiles along with sick Jews, and one buries dead Gentiles along with dead Jews. All this is done on account of the ways of peace to foster peaceful relations between Jews and Gentiles. Now, granted, you may say that that seems to say we're doing it for the sake of peaceful relations, meaning it's something that we do because it's good for us as well. It keeps peace with those non-Jews. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that is a motivation and a way of getting people to commit to thinking in larger terms, then so be it. But it's quite clear that that is a responsibility we have, at least through this Talmudic quotation. We have a responsibility for everyone. It's not just for those among us that we may be able to identify, but we have to acknowledge that there are others in other communities who are worthy of our attention as well. Back in the 60s, actually he died just, I think, last year, there's a famous sociologist, Nathan Glazer, who talked about what the Jewish community should be doing, and I use in his words, this was written in 1962, the Negro community. It's something called the City and Jewish Responsibility. And I would suggest, just as out of curiosity, to read the article and the responses that some came out with, where basically Glazer was saying, we need to be aware because we're in a good position at that time. We don't have a lot of crises. We don't have a lot of serious problems. So we need to make sure that we make resources available and help the Negro community to pull itself up because they are not as well off as we are. And some of the feedback about that was that if you've taken a good look at the Jewish community, we have needs that are pretty serious. This is back in 1962. We maybe can't afford to be thinking of others when we need to be thinking of ourselves. That was a response. Another response was saying the last thing the Negro, in his words, community wants is to be told what's good for them by non-Negroes, by Jews. That's not the way to do it. We need to go and provide them with the means to manage those types of programs and activities on their own. Anyway, a fascinating discussion of what Jewish responsibility might have been back in the 1960s. And I'll take a couple of perhaps more modern examples where we've chosen to take on causes that are not necessarily within our community. You're of course familiar, I'll come back to Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched in that famous march on Selma, saw Jewish responsibility with the Black community, identifying with them and trying to do something to change that situation. Very, very active role. And of course, there are many others who went down there, freedom activists who went down to the south to try to help register voters as well, many of those who were Jewish that you're probably familiar with. More recent example, there's this, most of you are familiar with, Rabbi Walker probably better than we are, with what the current administration in the States has done in terms of its policy regarding immigrants trying to come in through Mexico to the southern border. An organization called Voces de la Frontera to try to protect those who come in rather than being turned away. And a community in Wisconsin called Never Again Is Now took upon themselves to support this action by Voces de la Frontera and to identify with their cause, both because we've experienced that idea of being a stranger, of being immigrants, and so we understand what it means to make people feel at home and not alienated and not even allowing them to come into a country where they have a chance for a better life. Another example. And of course, you're all familiar with our sense of identity with the Muslim community just last year when that horrible attack took place in New Zealand, and many communities around the Jewish world, and here especially in the GTA, went to form protective symbolic circles around various mosques, and Beth David sent a delegation to be a participant in that as well. Something that says very powerfully the fact that we need to stand together with others in their times of crisis, and to be fair, just as they did with us. When an attack on a synagogue took place in Norway back in 2006, as well as the horror of Pittsburgh a year and a half ago, and other such instances, we've had support from the non-Jewish community, Muslim, Christian, and others who've identified with our crises and stood with us in our times of trouble and challenge as well. And there are many other instances of organizations that you're very well familiar with. The Havta doing all sorts of things, particularly with the homeless, but not only. An organization called Facing History, run by Leora Schaefer, talking about taking responsibility for what's happened to the indigenous community over the decades and trying to make amends with that community through education and social action. There are innumerable organizations in Israel which address a whole series of different needs for different alienated segments of the population, whatever they may be, and we don't have time to detail that right now. And what are some of the things that we do here at Beth David? So just recently, we had a Tikkun Olam Sunday where we expressed our understanding of the needs of the community in various ways, involving our kids and our families and all sorts of activities, supporting their needs. We do things such as collecting plastic bags to make mattresses for the needy. We do food collection and meals at Evangel Hall. And we talked about before the conflict when two social responsibility needs are in conflict with one another. So this past week, this past Sunday, we had committed to going down to preparing and serving a meal. And we decided, based on our responsibility of a social and community nature, that this is something that we were too hesitant to do due to the danger. But instead, we decided we couldn't simply call it off. So we made a generous donation to Evangel Hall in terms of a financial donation. And we had ordered kiddush, all sorts of trays of pasta. It was too late to cancel. So we took those down and gave them for that meal this past Sunday. So we raised the question before, somebody asked about when two such social responsibility needs conflict, what do? We look for a way of answering both. We try to find a way to balance considerations of both those needs. We don't say, well, one takes precedence, we'll do this, and the other one will have to take second stage for now. No, we be a little more creative in finding ways to continue to answer both those needs. But of course, sometimes there are instances where people do not act socially responsible, even in times of crisis. We talked about before people hoarding things and making a profit, trying to sell it on Kijiji and Amazon. But I also have to say that I'm incredibly impressed, and I think it's rather unprecedented, the response that has been from companies. Every day, I get 20 emails from different banks and financial institutions talking about the fact that they're going to be giving with different things and take those types of items off Kijiji and Amazon, which people were trying to sell at great profit to themselves. And I'll just give you one tiny personal example. As most of us do, we have a date by which we have to pay our different credit cards or whatever. So this month, I forgot to pay the credit card on the 10th of the month, and I paid it only on the 15th. So I called MasterCard yesterday. It wasn't the first time I've done it, but I called them yesterday just to see what would happen, and I was very polite, et cetera, trying to explain what happened. I just got caught up with everything, and I neglected to make the payment on time. If they could possibly be a little forgiving this time. Without hesitating one bit, without having to call a supervisor, the person on the end of the phone says, oh, you know, I completely understand. It's not a problem. I'm going to make a note here. If you're charged the interest, it'll be refunded to you. And I'm going to make another note because it may be a little late to do that. If you're charged at this time, I'm going to personally make sure that the interest is refunded to you. And don't worry about it. We understand completely. I don't want you to have to call again and wait online to speak with somebody. So I'm going to take care of it all now. Just check to make sure that goes through. Never had that before from MasterCard. And I think a lot of the responses that we've seen from credit card companies, from banks, from places like Kijiji and Amazon have been incredibly socially responsible in recent days. And I think the immensity of the crisis, of course, is something that demands, but people don't always respond in that way. And I think we're very fortunate that individuals as well as corporations are seeing the need to act socially responsible. Just a few last points before we conclude. So we spoke about the directives and the instructions offered in our rich sources and tradition to respond to the needs of those among us that we don't often see, and to be a little more active in doing things. So what I'm going to do is, I often say to my students, you need to be a Rosh Gadol. You can't wait to respond to something or say that I can't handle it, it's beyond me, I'm overwhelmed. You need to do something and get out there in front of things. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to ask each of you, as part of an exercise, I'm going to ask you to email me at mrubin@bethdavid.com, and I'm going to send you a list of the many organizations, by no means exhaustive, within the Jewish community, both abroad and in Israel and Canada, that deal with all sorts of social responsibility issues. And I'm going to ask that you pick one of those organizations that you're not familiar with, but whose values and mission are something that you believe in. And I want you to send that to me and think of ways in which those goals, those aims, those tasks, those values are something that we or you can implement in our community, whether it be Beth David, whether it be your school community, whatever community. I want you to send something to me that indicates that you feel there's something that you can do with these values with which you identify. And that's what I'll consider being proactive Rosh Gadol with regards to social responsibility. There was something I came across on the website of a community in Mercer County, New Jersey, which talks about what are the benefits of teen volunteering. Develops an increased sense of social responsibility, a global view of society, and a heart for giving back and helping others. Exposes teens to diversity. Provides an opportunity to apply academic learning to real human needs. Builds relationships and social connectedness with peers, adults, and activists sharing a cause. Improves communication and critical thinking skills. Help students find their passions and interests that may lead to a career choice they have not considered. So we have all these wonderful reasons, not just for teens, but for ourselves, in order for us to find not a justification, but a meaningful way to engage in volunteering, in social responsibility activities. And I would hope that these tangible and practical reasons for being involved for our own benefit, let alone for those to whom we want to be helping, is something that you would be willing to take seriously. And lastly, something we say every day, and Birchot HaShachar. I would say that beyond everything, in addition to everything I've said, the basis for our engagement with social responsibility and seeing it as a priority is because we need to understand something about the divine element in each of us. And with the broadest possible definition and understanding of what divine means. And what do I mean by that? Whatever you make of the essence of the divine, when we recite these blessings, we often thank the divine, God, whoever, whatever, for allowing us to open our eyes, who opens the eyes of the blind, who provides clothing for the naked, who frees the captive, who raises up the fallen. Meaning all those poor people out there who don't have the benefits of these physical abilities, emotional abilities, we thank God for doing that. However, if we're willing to see the divine element in ourselves, it means that we should be aware of and acknowledge that divine responsibility and the divine ability and mission to take care of these things. And one of the things I tell my B'nai Mitzvah and their families at a service, often when it's their own service, I say, when you read these Birchot HaShachar today and from now on, I want you to say this: praised are you, Adonai, God, ruler of the universe, who has allowed me to open the eyes of the blind, who has allowed me and given me the resources to provide clothing for the naked, who gives me the ability to free the captive, and who encourages me to raise up the fallen. Meaning, because I have a sense of divine purpose and divine responsibility, I'm not going to be grateful to God for taking care of this for others. I need to go out and look for those people, and it's my responsibility to help them. And if we're able to see that as part of the divine element that's within each of us and the responsibility that's incumbent upon us, then we'll be able to answer the needs of as many as possible, regardless of the fact of whether there will always be people out there. And perhaps, as harsh a thing it is to say, perhaps it's a good thing that there are always people out there. Because if we're not aware of a need and we don't go seeking a need that exists or doesn't yet exist, then we may not take appropriate action when we need to take it. So I want to thank you all for committing to exploring together social responsibility today. I hope that in the coming days, we all find ways of balancing social responsibility, both in light of the COVID-19 crisis, but as well as in light of all our ongoing responsibilities to our families and to our communities and to the world at large. And I hope we can continue to meet under these circumstances, electronically and otherwise, regardless of what the world does to us or offers to us in terms of viruses, etc. So thank you all, and Yishar Kochachem, and look forward to continue our study together on other occasions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rabbi Walker. It's been very much appreciated.
More programs coming your way. Be on the lookout.
And I'm glad I finally got myself settled out with my audio. So
are we, Anna.
And I've got my audio, but I have no video.
Well, we'll work on it.
Exactly. It's a work in progress.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was so relevant for today. Incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Keep the programs coming.
bye.
Bye.